Hi. So let's dive into the absurd after the myth of Sisyphus. The notion of the absurd can be reconciled to suicide. So this is Albert Camus' main theses in the myth of Sisyphus. And but after I added though that after further inquiry, suicide is a mere extreme version of the absurd. So the absurd might arise because people who commit suicide perceive they have reached the meaning of life and they have lost hope, and so they decide to end their life. But they can't be around obviously to witness its impact, the suicide's impact. So there's no real absurd that arises. But you could still state, like, Camus still argues that the absurd arises in suicide because there is hope in the afterlife, and yet there is only death in the afterlife. So there's that contradiction, and that's what you need to have for the absurd to occur. So the relationship here is only true under individual thought and suicide. If this was between social thought, like a gathering or more than one person thinking about this, then this would be different. The situation and the absurd would arise differently. But so this is skewed to private thoughts that one acts on. And it's impossible. Another point that Camus actually says to lessen this reconciliation to suicide for the absurd is that it's impossible to be logical to the bitter end, death by suicide, which shows infinite regress to no absurdity at that moment of death. That's what I argue. And since the above relationship is intangible and only lives with weak extensions, suicide is by logic and premise mere emotional inclination that the absurd does not contain. So because people act just emotionally, there cannot be any absurd arising in suicide because it's mainly an emotional reaction that occurs. Suicide is a confession, Camus argues, but this is by analogy only, and dying and suicide are used independently of one another. And that's important because the act of dying is different than the act of suicide then. And because dying is associated more with the absurd notions of life, that life isn't worth living, that meaningless in life. And it's sort of romanticized through the image of someone dying rather than someone committing suicide. So it's like Camus making maybe a mistake there, that he's saying that suicide is just like dying, but I think that they're separate entities, or that they could be argued to be separate. And there's an absence of meaning of life. Just because there's an absence of meaning of life, this is what Camus points out, does not necessarily mean that life isn't worth living, and certainly doesn't mean that you should kill yourself. So there's a couple of jumps there in faith, let's say, to steal Kierkegaard's analogies. There's generally no more meaning in death as there is in life. So in choosing an escape, this is not a solution to the absurd. This is just destroys the absurd and ultimately doesn't accept the absurd. Although Camus would argue that it's an extreme form of acceptance, suicide, but I disagree. I think that because life and death both share meaninglessness, it's just like a swap for lesser grounds. The feeling of the absurd could be disentangled from suicide. So this is my main point. Absurdity as a feeling can strike without warning. This unexpected spontaneity of the absurd is not experienced in death nor in dying, and that might include suicide. One does not make a point in suicide that is ever successful in clearly confessing something. Only in life, with openness to the absurd, acceptance of the absurd is allowed, does the feeling of the absurd exhibit itself. So these conditions aren't really met with suicide. There's no openness with the absurd. There's no life. There's are you really successfully confessing, or are you just making an absurdity when you're committing suicide? Sincerity is also an issue. In life, it is clear, but in suicide, is it all clear? It's mainly just emotional inclination again. And suicide is much like killing yourself because the way nature appears, or the way your nature will appear during the process of dying. So people are interested in killing themselves just for like sport, and should that be considered absurd? Well, it actually should be considered absurd in itself, but it's not an experience of the absurd, and it's certainly not a feeling of the absurd. And I think there are, in life you can experience these absurdities, but in death you can't. So the final point is, if the absurd arises due to an imbalance in one's need in something not being fulfilled or urged on by the universe, this is the definition of the absurd, it is only through the adventure or journey of life that one finds and confronts and accepts the absurd. And the absurd only occurs, therefore, in life. So in suicide, you don't have this adventure, you don't have this journey of life that you're finding and you're confronting and accepting. You're just simply giving in. Okay, thank you very much for listening.